I remember September 11, 2001. I was a chemical engineering student leaving an early morning class, going to the engineering building, and I saw clusters of other students around the TVs. They were watching the Twin Towers, aflame and on fire. My reaction kinetics class was canceled, and there was a lot of concern. And this really penetrated a lot of our memories. Over the course of time, let me see if I can advance this once. Over the course of time, reports came out about what happened during 9/11. There was ultimately this final report by the 9/11 Commission. And surprisingly, it reflected a lot of the same information that was in the Pearl Harbor report almost 60 years earlier. A couple years later, Hurricane Katrina came. It pummeled New Orleans. And surprisingly, this bipartisan report that came and analyzed what had happened leading to Katrina reported some of the same findings that had been in the 9/11 report, in the Pearl Harbor report. What we started to notice is a pattern of information sharing failures that repeated themselves across disasters. We are now able to see these same information sharing failures happen in major disasters like the Virginia Tech shooting or the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We're starting to see a repetition of the same things. Let me give you a couple examples, and then let me give you an idea of why. And what I'd like to do is talk about how we can safeguard against these in our modern era with our modern industrial control systems. So let me give you a first example. Conflation of authority or ambiguity of responsibility. So during Pearl Harbor, one of the liaison between the Army and the Navy was a second lieutenant. And you don't have to know much about military organization or ranks to know that a general and an admiral are probably not going to listen to a second lieutenant. They were given a lot of responsibility to liaise between these organizations, but they didn't have the authority. During 9/11, we saw overlapping responsibilities between FAA and FBI and other intelligence organizations. Each of them had enough responsibility and authority that they thought they had enough information that resulted in hidden profiles of information across the federal government, which ultimately could have potentially prevented these terrorist attacks from happening. In Hurricane Katrina, we saw overlapping responsibilities between the local government, the state government, and the federal government. And what happened was there wasn't enough. This was before, by the way, ICS was prevalent at the state and local. The incident command system was prevalent down at the state and local and municipal governments. But we saw this overlapping responsibility result in lack of coordination or coordinated outcomes. And even, I'm in the water sector, Xylem provides water technologies. So even in Oldsmar, a attack on a water utility just outside of Tampa around the time of the Super Bowl, some valid credentials were used to log into a TeamViewer. We see the same kind of conflation of authority, right? IT security is responsible for the stack, which included TeamViewer. OT security is responsible for operations, which included TeamViewer. And now we see the same kind of repetition happening again. Another example, failed verification of important features. In Pearl Harbor, there was a war warning sent from the admiral in Washington, D.C. to the admiral in Hawaii. The intent of the war warning was to deploy the fleet. The actual results of the war warning was a misinterpretation of what that war warning implied and a different set of decisions, resulting in failed collaboration between Washington and Hawaii. In 9/11, Attorney General Ashcroft had sent a brief to the immigration services, expecting them to understand this potential for terrorist attacks using the takeover of airplanes and ramming them into important targets. The immigration services had detained some of these terrorists, but they were released, not understanding that this potentially could result in some kind of disaster, and the disaster happened, something that potentially could have been averted. In Hurricane Katrina, we saw personal requests that were made to individuals in FEMA. Those individuals in FEMA promised the grant of these requests, but there was no tracking system to track it through the system and verify that these kinds of decisions and actions actually happened as a result of this information sharing. And finally, even in Oldsmar, there was an operator sitting when these valid credentials were used to log into TeamViewer, and there was an assumption made that this was a valid operation until they changed the sodium hydroxide level by 2 orders of magnitude. And the operator realized something was going on and changed them back. What we need, the lesson that we need to take away from this is that this wasn't a failure in all of these cases. These weren't failures of technology. The technology was adequate. We had radar systems that were working in Hawaii before Pearl Harbor. We had intelligence processing systems that were working before 9/11. We had the technology for information sharing and information movement, right? We had even link analysis and early assessment procedures that were already in operations that had been beyond a proof of concept. In Hurricane Katrina, we had massive sensor operations, and we were projecting the pathway and the power and the wind speed of this hurricane. But in the end, the failure was the failure of people and information. These 25 information sharing failures could be valuable to us because our systems are beginning to become more complex. Our systems are beginning to require shared responsibility. Just begin to think about how many of your systems are connected now. How many of your systems are sending information to remote monitoring, cloud analytics, third-party resources. This is starting to happen more and more. What we're seeing is a shift from this kind of historical model on the left, where the operator procures, owns, and operates all of their technology in organized, potentially historically, according to maybe a naive Purdue model, we should say, that was mostly hierarchical. And we're seeing a shift towards things that look more like what's on the right: complex, integrated, connected, requiring partnerships. I mean, how many times, even during this conference, just during this conference perhaps, have we heard things like managed security services or cloud services or virtualization or containerization, software as a service? And the reason why this is happening is because it provides a lot of value. When I first came to work for Xylem, one of the first case studies that I started reading was a case of South Bend, Indiana. They were dumping about a dozen Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of wastewater into the St. Joseph's River every day because of their aging wastewater system. They had an engineering consulting firm come in, estimated that to rework their entire wastewater system was going to cost on the order of something like $850 million, which for a small town would have resulted in a cost of about $11,000 per household. That is unaffordable. What we did is we installed about 200 flow and level sensors throughout their system. These were connected to gateways, which brought the traffic back to a cloud analytics where we could update the algorithm that we needed as we were collecting and seeing the data. And in the end, there was a lot of downstream capacity that was underutilized. And so with about a $200 million investment, saving them $500 million in capital expenses, they were able to resolve about 85% of all of their overflow problems. It also allowed us to introduce a new control algorithm. So instead of having to develop all the logic in IEC 61131 compliant logic and put it onto a traditional controller, we can now pull all of this, and we actually created kind of a little mini stock market where these flow and level sensors would basically bid on downstream capacity based on how the wastewater conditions were changing. In the end, this is still saving them about $1.5 million per year during operations. E. coli concentrations in the St. Joseph's River have been cut in half. The overflow has been completely eradicated during dry seasons and has been stopped by over 70% overall. And this is because of connected digital technologies. When I was at GE before I came to Xylem, we had tons of case studies like this, where we would connect through an edge controller back to some kind of a data warehouse where the analysis of the life cycle of the turbines with the operations and the operational conditions and the market prices of gas per cubic square foot and wholesale prices of electricity were all included into how to optimize an operation. Some of these cases were saving companies over $100 million a year. In oil and gas, we were paying third parties to come in and access this operations data, and we were able to do predictive maintenance in a way that it would save them $20, $30, $40 million a year because they're able to now predict when their systems need maintenance and when they're going to fail. This highly complex and integrated architectures are not going to go away. And not only that, but it's going to require an increasing amount of information sharing. It's going to require an increasing amount of collaboration in order to accomplish the collaborative outcomes that we desire from these next generation of industrial control systems. And so the question is, how do we safeguard against these information sharing failures in securing of our industrial control systems and their supply chains? So the first lesson of history that's really important that I want to emphasize is that when the goal of information sharing is to share information, then typically all of these 25 information sharing failures occur and information sharing doesn't succeed. We have to flip the goal first. The goal of information sharing must be collaborative outcomes. When the goal of information sharing is collaborative outcomes, then we start to see some structure of information sharing take place that can actually evoke the kind of actions, decisions and actions that are necessary to accomplish these end objectives. And so what happens is we start to obtain what I'm calling in this slide a common stewardship of information. This isn't to say open sharing or publicly available, right? This is still implying protection of information, but we're protecting each other's information, and we're starting to create this atmosphere of a shared responsibility between the component supplier, and the end user. So there are three major pieces of successful information sharing when we start to flip this paradigm for collaborative outcomes. So on the very right-hand side of this diagram, collaborative outcomes drive what kind of information we need to fuse and how we need to fuse it, because it determines what kind of decisions and actions need to be coordinated. That then results in us helping us to define these communication channels, which, by the way, is the easiest part. Having the common communication for being able to push and pull information, that's the easy part. And then those channels help to define these partnership models that we need in order to collect, derive, share that information through these communication channels. So let me give you examples of how this has worked. So the first example is Food Shield. So I don't know if you guys remember, but about a decade or so ago, there was some contaminated salsa. A government organization basically blamed it on tomatoes from Florida, destroyed an entire tomato crop, from Florida, ravaged their community. Companies went out of business. About 9 months or so later, after all the testing and supply chain tracking was done, they learned that it was peppers from Mexico. And so this was a problem. And so the question was, how does this food emergency response team enable this ability to get those who have the information, right, the product manufacturers, access to the testing facilities, and how do they push the information from the testing facilities into an analytic environment where they can go through and trace back what is necessary in order to actually determine these things. So they created this thing called Food Shield, which has a predefined set of collaborative outcomes that are desired: the testing, the audits, the supply chain tracing. They derived a set of document repositories and communication channels where that information could be available, and even communication about who's going to pay for the testing and which facility is going to pay what facility and how that money transfer is going to happen. And then on the partnership side, they established something called a common organizational registry environment. So they defined all of the roles that were necessary in order to accomplish these collaborative outcomes in this environment. And then companies, suppliers, food vendors, transport, testing, they could come in and they could register their employees according to the roles that they would need to be able to participate in. The result is a food emergency nowadays typically is resolved within 72 hours. It went from months to days because they focused on collaborative outcomes, not just on a document sharing repository or creating some kind of a joint analytic product. It was driven by these collaborative outcomes that were defined. Another example, we don't yet have the verdict of history on this, but this example demonstrates a lot of these types of behaviors that we want in good, strong information sharing systems. So the article went something like this. This is from New York Times. As Russia is rolling their tanks into Ukraine, Microsoft is doing the final analysis of some new malware, and they have the authority to collect this kind of information. They have the organization that incentivizes them to collect this information and to share it with their customers. They have communication channels, particularly with their customers, in order to get this information out. And they know that they want to influence the decisions and actions of those who are using their systems. So what happens in the story is the director of this Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center calls up Ms. Ann Nuremberger, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor for cybersecurity in the White House, and he says, hey, we have this new information about this new malware. We believe that it's relevant to what you're doing. Do you need more information about it? She then connects them with, according to the New York Times article, all the people that they need, and eventually Microsoft Threat Intel Center is sending this information to the Baltic states, and to Poland in order to enhance their ability to be protected. Now, what I started learning about is that this is part of this joint cyber defense collaborative that's emerging. Now, in this particular case, there are some things that weren't clear in the public-facing information, right? One of these common information sharing failures is the conflation of formal versus personal relationships. So it's still, the verdict of history has not yet been unfolded in this case. And even with these collaborative outcomes, there is this, one of these common information sharing failures where things are so rigid and so structured that they fail to be able to account for these exigent circumstances, these unusual circumstances that emerge whenever you have a complex system that's operating. So I am really excited about this announcement of this joint cyber defense collaborative for industrial control systems. As I've been looking into what it is and learning about how it's structured, it is structured around accomplishing collaborative outcomes. They want to change the paradigm from information sharing for sharing of information's sake to operational collaboration, where they're able to leverage the value of not just information, but organizational structure, collection activities, incentives, where organizations that were listed by Director Easterly earlier this morning are already collecting these kinds of information. So the question is, what will the verdict of history be? And so up on this slide, it's clear from public resources that they've already put safeguards in place against probably a majority of these information sharing failures. And the question will be, can they put them in place for everything else? So what are these collaborative outcomes for industrial control systems? So I'm thinking they fit probably into 4 categories. And I think it's important that these 4 categories cover the entire supply chain. On the left-hand side, we need to secure products, right? We need secure boot, root of trust, chain of trust. We need to have the ability to look into these products and see whether there are vulnerabilities before commercialization. We need to have chain of trust go all the way up to update mechanisms and communications drivers. And these communications drivers need to start being able to uniquely identify endpoints, sign the messages for integrity verification, encrypt and obfuscate, authorize, right? So we need to start building secure products. On the right-hand side, it's not enough to build secure products because Microsoft might build a secure Excel spreadsheet, but if you put your social security numbers in it and post it onto the internet, it can't be Microsoft's fault. And so we need to have these secure deployment mechanisms where we are able to architect these products together in a way that they become the solution that we need, the solution that is secure by design. Now, on the bottom, now we're starting to get into the operator's domain. We need continuous health and monitoring of these systems, and then finally, we need incident response. So these are going to be these 4 collaborative outcomes, but if we look, there's kind of a problem in terms of who is able to do what along the spectrum. And for illustration purposes, on the left is the product supplier, right? The product supplier, we should be paying attention to products, and we are. We should be building security into products. We are providing security context into secure deployment guides. We're trying to help integrators to do this kind of secure architecture. As we move over to the integrators, they're paying attention to which products they're selecting. They're paying attention to the architecture, and they might even be setting the stage for a collection management framework for continuous monitoring as the system is deployed. And then over on the right-hand side, the operator is doing this type of continuous monitoring and then incident response. But you'll notice that there's not a single player here that does it all. And so the question is, how do we push and pull information in a way that it will actually promote coordinated actions and decisions that will drive this kind of security? So I wanted to give maybe an example from my recent experience. We wanted to develop a gateway in order to meet market prices. We needed to use a third-party platform. We decided on what security outcomes we wanted to, and we negotiated into the statement of work that they would work with us to accomplish these security outcomes. So one of them was a secure by design architecture on this gateway. And so we sat with our component supplier, and we did a threat model together. Right? A threat model is this process where you lay out all the data flows, you then go through each of the data flows and talk about how you could spoof it, tamper it, repudiate, deny service, disclose information, right, on each of these data flows, and then you decide on a control design. When we first began this process, the supplier really thought that we were calling their baby ugly. But as we worked together towards this outcome, and as we shared information about our overall design of how we were going to use this gateway, and they shared information about their design of their component itself, we were able to find new sources of entropy on the hardware that they were already using, which enabled us to do different kinds of things in the way that we chain trust. We were able to enforce authentication on every single port and wire that's sticking out of this device that could be connected to. And then finally, when we were doing the manufacturing process, we worked with them to figure out a way that we could chain trust up to a certificate signing request that would be generated on the firmware. We could then give the third-party manufacturer a special API key that we could track. They could then call an API at our certificate authority, which would then go and get that certificate signing request, sign it from the chain of trust. We then on our side could take that chain of trust, put it in our IoT shadow configuration for how it connects to the cloud. And these devices can now self-provision. We don't have to trust the third-party supplier because we've worked out an architecture that was innovative in the context. And it was innovative because it resulted from two-way information sharing that was geared towards these collaborative outcomes. So the bottom line that I hope that you take away from this is that there are these 25 common information sharing failures. We are going to be subject to them if we focus on sharing information. One example that I would like us to reconsider is security questionnaires. Security questionnaires are designed for the purpose of sharing information, not for collaborative outcomes. They're expensive, and they're easily defeated by anyone who attempts to overcome them. This isn't information sharing that's going to drive collaborative outcomes that we desire, the ones that will actually help to protect our systems. And as we embrace this idea of collaborative outcomes, what we will start to realize is that there emerges this need for a shared responsibility. The owners, operators, the utilities are going to have to start sharing this responsibility with the suppliers, and the suppliers are going to have to step up and start providing increased amounts of visibility, understanding, and control to those customers for whom they're providing these connected digital services. This is what will result in collaborative outcomes, and this is what will help us to accomplish industrial control systems, cybersecurity across a complex supply chain with the next generation of digital and connected technologies. So if you replay this and want to pause, you can prove it to yourself. Here's all the sources that go through everything that I talked about. And I hope that this starts a conversation about collaborative outcomes and shared responsibilities. Thank you.